Your Excellency, Consul General, distinguished colleagues and friends, I cannot tell you what a privilege it is to be back at the University of Sao Paulo. So thank you very much indeed for this incredibly warm welcome. But it has been a warm welcome to Brazil because, as Laura mentioned, we've had just a phenomenal transnational journey in Brasilia and then up to Manaus, where again it was an incredibly warm welcome. We had a fabulous seminar there at the weekend. For me though, it's very special to come back to USP because, as Lara said, I had many visits here as the VP or the Vice President for Global Relations at Trinity. And the purpose of those visits was really to build academic collaborations with some of the finest Brazilian universities, and especially with the Irish Studies program here at USP. So I'm particularly grateful to see these blossom. Munira will be coming to spend some time with us in Trinity in May as part of a big European program we have called the Spectris program. We've already had many colleagues from Brazil there, and we look forward to welcoming more. But I want to say a special word of thanks to Rosalie for the Haddad Scholarship. I had the privilege of meeting Talita, who is the current holder of the scholarship. You know, Brazil has not got a better ambassador. She is fabulous. She's doing an MA, a taught MPhil with us on the writings of Brian Friel. She is just on fire, and she brings that great Brazilian passion. And on a windy day in Dublin, that goes a long way, I'm telling you. Anyway, and we look forward then to welcoming another young student next year, because this is how we build the future in terms of relationships. So I'd just love to see more and more of this sort of activity. So thank you very, very much indeed. Really, it means a huge amount. I am really, as the ambassador said, an expert on the early modern period. So I'm coming to 1916 with a very long lens. I also am very interested in Ireland and Empire. And I spent last year as the Parnell Fellow at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and as a fellow at JNU University in Delhi, and developed a research interest in colonial Ireland, colonial India. So as I look at 1916, as I say, I take a very long perspective and a very broad geographical perspective too. So what you're about to receive is very much an overview. Colleagues this afternoon will be looking at Casement in some detail, and Brian, that's why my heart sank for just a moment, because actually I'm not going to say very much about Casement, but I will, I hope, give you the context, geographic and chronological, as we reflect a little bit on especially the consequences of the Easter Rising, which broke out on Easter Sunday 2016, when roughly 1,200 insurgents seized the General Post Office on O'Connell Street, along with other strategic locations across the country, and when this man here, Patrick Pearse, proclaimed a free Irish Republic. Now, he proclaimed it to a rather bewildered group of onlookers, and it wasn't really a grand proclamation. It was more of a hastily drawn-up speech, a manifesto at best, but it did declare the rights of the people of Ireland to be sovereign, and looked forward to the establishment of a native government elected on democratic principles of self-determination. But it's very important to point out that it was another 32 years, 1948, before Ireland actually became a republic. The British, of course, were mired in a global conflict, World War I, also known as the Great War, but they did suppress the rising with unnecessary force. And you can see here's Trinity, the GPO, and there was this literally ring around Dublin, and they battered the bejesus, basically, out of the insurgents. Trinity College, this is where the British troops gathered, so this is Front Square. There was carnage. 450 people died, 250 of them civilians, and the city centre was utterly devastated as some of these pictures from a wonderful exhibition organised by the National Library of Ireland, I think really capture the total devastation to the inner city centre. That's the GPO, completely taken out. And again, you can see just the devastation of Lower O'Connell Street. And basically, to prevent further devastation and loss of life, Pearse declared an unconditional surrender after only 6 days. Now, the rising was a complete and utter military failure, and the initial media reaction to it was of outright condemnation. But this all began to change very rapidly as the government court-martialed and then executed 15 of the principal leaders of the rising. And this was happening in the face of very strong protest in Ireland, in Britain and America. Now, most of the 15 died in Dublin. However, one man who's very dear to all of your hearts in terms of this conference, of course, Roger Casement, it was August, the 3rd of August 1916, before he was hung in London. The rising, as I say, a complete military failure, but it nonetheless changed utterly the face of Irish history. And it then set in train an unstoppable process which led to the separation of Ireland from Great Britain, and it also then accelerated the demise of the British Empire, which, as you can see from this map here, traversed the globe. It was an empire upon which the sun quite literally never set. And for me, that's why it's actually a revolution rather than a rising, because even though it was some time before we see the consequences being permanent, they were very, very permanent indeed. So what I want to do is look at the wider contexts. I'm going to start with the chronological context, because I actually think it was very important, and it's very important to take the story back to the beginning. And of course, the declaration itself referred to the long usurpation by a foreign people and government, and then it also recited how in every generation the Irish people have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty. 6 times during the past 300 years they've asserted it in arms. 1641, 1689, 1798, 1803, 1848 and 1867. The long usurpation actually began with the conquest of Ireland in the late 12th century. Now this makes Ireland England's oldest colony. And then with the onset of the Protestant Reformation in the 1530s, all of a sudden Ireland, with its very large Catholic population, represents a very real security threat to Protestant England. It meant that Ireland had to be conquered. And then during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Crown also embarks on a very intense series of initiatives that sought to Anglicise and civilise, always in inverted commas, Ireland. Central to this was the promotion of English law, the English language, English culture, English architecture, English economic and agricultural practices, and above all, the English religion, Protestantism. English imperialism in early modern Ireland was exploitative and driven by military, political, cultural, religious and economic concerns, but also by a determination to colonise the island with British settlers. And during the course of the 17th century, 350,000, mostly Protestants, from Scotland, Wales and England colonised Ireland, Munster, but especially Ulster. And these, of course, were the ancestors of what we know as the Ulster Unionists today. People in Ireland weren't entirely happy, of course, about this, and we see a very significant revolt against plantation and colonisation in 1641. And during this period, actually, Ireland, it's a decade that Ireland is independent of Britain, But actually, the Irish didn't want independence. This was not a separatist movement in the 1640s. It was that circumstances made it so. And they actually were rebelling in the name of the king. So what we see in 1641 is actually a form of constitutional nationalism. And it was only a very small minority of people in the 1640s who were actually calling for Ireland to be a republic. And I think what we see with the 1641 rebellion is these two strands of nationalism coming to the fore. And the first one, of course, isn't culture. Firstly, it's constitutional nationalism, i.e. autonomy within the context of the British Empire or Home Rule, and then republican nationalism, separatist. And cultural nationalism is something that we associate then from the mid-19th century. And that's, if you want, emphasising the distinctiveness of Irish cultural identity. And these strands of nationalism are very much present. They inform each other, and sometimes the differences between them isn't very clear at all. The other point I just want to make as a general one is when we think of nationalists, we tend to look at it through a sectarian lens today. But contemporaries, of course, many were Protestant, many were Catholic, so nationalism actually didn't know the sectarian divides. A good example of this is, of course, this man, Wolfe Tone, who led the 1798 rebellion of the United Irishmen. And this also brings us to the point that actually external influences both make possible and profoundly shape the face of Irish nationalism. The United Irishmen were inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, but especially by the French Revolution, which broke out in 1789. And for men like Tone, the enunciation of principles of liberty and equality, the abolition of privileges, the reshaping of the institutions of the state in accordance with the rights of the people, all seemed to herald the dawn of a new era. I think it's also interesting to note how the language of the 1916 proclamation echoes that of the French Declaration. Now, the 1798 rebellion lasted a few months, but it was also a military failure, but that's not what mattered. What mattered was how it influenced the thinking of later generations of nationalists, especially this man here, Robert Emmet, who isn't famous for his bungled attempt at rebellion in 1803, but for his very stirring oration from the gallows. And Emmet becomes a role model then for the likes of Pearse, and of course Pearse has almost Emmet delusions. So again, it's this one movement influencing the next. And of course, 1798 did have very significant consequences in that it paved the way for the Act of Union with Britain. The undoing of that union, whether through simple repeal or through schemes for home rule, later became the political hobby horse for constitutional nationalists, while the maintenance of the union became the goal of many Protestants, especially in Ulster. Here you can see that from the cartoon. The Act of Union defines the context of Irish parliamentary politics over the next 100 years. The members of a movement known as Young Irelanders drew great inspiration from the United Irishmen. During the 1840s, they're calling for Catholic emancipation and, above all, the repeal of the Act of Union. Their mouthpiece was the Nation newspaper. It was launched by Thomas Davis, who was a Protestant lawyer from Dublin, a Trinity graduate as it happens, and Charles Gavin Duffy, a Catholic journalist from Belfast. And for these young Irelanders, Ireland was a spiritual entity in itself, and they believed it was their job to create a national spirit. And as such, they were the first real exponents of cultural nationalism. They also harnessed the power of print very, very effectively, and the nation was packed with stories celebrating the heroic past of Ireland, the rebellions of 41, 78, 1803. They published biographies of saints, of scholars, of soldiers, along with patriotic ballads, We Owe a Nation Once Again, which I'm sure some of you have heard sung many times to Davis. They also put a high value on dying for Ireland and helped inculcate a verbal cult of physical violence. And again, Pearse took great inspiration from the Young Irelanders, dubbing them the fathers of Irish nationalism. The Fenians were led by former Young Irelanders. Now, the Fenian movement had its origins in the disasters which overwhelmed Ireland in the late 1840s, especially the famine. And the Fenian movement was really unique for its longevity. It seemed as if it was a spent force after its own abortive rising in 1867, but in fact it hung around for another 50 years. And in part, Fenianism owed its survival to the fact that so many of its founders, especially Donovan Rossa, who died in 1915, lived to be an unrepentant and influential old age, and these men then passed on the torch to men like Tom Clarke, who was a veteran Fenian, one of the organisers of the 1916 rebellion. And Clarke we almost can see as a sort of a professional revolutionary, but it was Pearse who gave the graveside oration at Donovan Ross's funeral, and turned it into an act of great spectacle and theatre. You can see Pearse here putting away his speech. I want to say a few words about Home Rule, because with the rise of a dynamic parliamentary Home Rule movement, all of a sudden the Fenians had competition, if you want, for the allegiance of Irish nationalists. And it was led by a hugely charismatic figure, Charles Stewart Parnell. And it was really Parnell who made Home Rule a viable option. And if the first Home Rule Bill in 1886, or even the second Home Rule Bill of 1893 had become law at a time when Unionist opposition was limited, the whole course of Anglo-Irish relations, indeed Irish history, might have been very, very different indeed. But of course that didn't happen. Home Rule is very important in an imperial context too, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to say a word though about the other strand of Irish nationalism that is so potent from the 1880s, and that's of course cultural nationalism. The nationalism of the late 19th and early 20th century placed great emphasis on the distinctiveness of Irish cultural identity and the need for economic, social and political self-reliance. The cultural nationalism, and you'll hear lots more about this from Luke later, but that governed most of the significant literary and intellectual activity in Ireland between 1890 and 1930, was distinct from political nationalism, but of course was very, very intimately associated with it. And a single example of this, there were 7 signatories of the 1916 proclamation. Of the 7, 4 were playwrights: Pearse, Connolly, MacDonagh and Plunkett. And of course some have argued that the rising itself, so redolent with symbolism, was in fact a deadly performance. I want to say a few words about the global dimensions of Irish nationalism. First and foremost, Fenianism found great support amongst the displaced survivors of the famine, especially those in North America. But we've discovered in Manaus at the weekend, also here in Brazil, I haven't appreciated fully that if you want, the tentacles of Fenianism did spread to Brazil. And in this sense, Fenianism was differed from all previous national movements in that it embraced not only the Irish at home, but also the new Ireland that immigration had created. And it was especially in Britain and America, where you see Fenians gaining great followings amongst immigrant Irish labourers and second generation migrants. And that group helped to fund the 1916 Rising through Fenian John Devoy. The New York Times gave the Rising front page coverage for 14 consecutive days. And then, of course, the Americans were great supporters of the Irish state in its early days. And that support continued actually right through until 9/11 and the bombing of the Twin Towers, when all of a sudden we see American support for Irish Republicans effectively drying up. Britain had lost the American colonies back in the late 18th century, but that didn't stop Britain going on to acquiring a global empire. And of course, Britain jealously guarded that empire and did everything it could to prevent the spread of nationalism to it, especially to the soldiers and bureaucrats, the Irish soldiers and bureaucrats who served in empire, because this is one of the things about the Irish, if you want, were both victims of imperialism, but active perpetrators of it. And I want to now switch and say a few words about Ireland and India, because I think this is a very interesting case study. And we can see with the advent of Irish nationalism from the 1880s, that the British government became extremely concerned about the Home Rule movement and how it would play out in India. Lord Dufferin, who you can see here, who of course was the man responsible for the Viceregal Lodge here in Shimla. He was of Ulster planter stock, and he regarded the foundation of the Indian National Congress in 1885 with great suspicion, and he regarded it as the Indian Home Rule movement. And of course he was right, and Parnell had been very active, actively reaching out to Indian nationalists with the view of establishing a movement on Irish lines. There were other strong links. Gandhi attributed the origin of his own mass movement of peaceful resistance in India to the Irish Land League, which served as a model of agrarian disturbance, and to Michael Davitt, this man here in the middle, who of course had pioneered peaceful methods of agitation and passive resistance, including the use of the boycott, rent strikes, and used the press very effectively. Davitt was an MP in London in the 1880s and 90s and struck up a great friendship with Nauroji, who was originally from Bombay and had played a key role in founding the Indian National Congress before moving to London, where he actually became the first Asian MP to sit in the Westminster Parliament. Nauroji published a very influential book called Poverty and Un-British Rule, which was about the drain of wealth from India to England through colonial rule. And of course, this resonated immediately with the Irish. A single example is, of course, Maud Gonne, a great Irish feminist and nationalist who cited Nauroji's works and speeches, suggesting, quote, that all Mr. Nauroji says of India applies equally to Ireland. She branded Queen Victoria the famine queen, said she was unfit to rule. Gonne also suggested in an article called India that the peoples of Ireland and India should die fighting rather than starving. Yeats, Maud Gonne was of course the great muse for Yeats, and Yeats had a very interesting connection with India too. He was fascinated by Indian mysticism and became a great supporter of the Bengali polymath Tagore, who had found aspects of Irish nationalism inspiring, especially the use of language, folklore and mythology. Yeats wrote the introduction to Gitanjali, which won Tagore a Nobel Prize, and he also facilitated the staging of one of Tagore's plays. It's actually called The Post Office, and it was staged in the Abbey Theatre in Dublin in May 1913. And it was the first play by Tagore to be staged out of India, so it was quite an event. But it also was a benefit performance for St Enda's College, a secondary school founded by Pearse. And it's lovely just to see how all of these circles start to intersect. So that was 1913. Well, of course, the following year, World War I broke out, and both Ireland and India put on hold their calls for home rule and volunteered for service. Now, as everybody in the room will know, it's one of the bloodiest wars of all time, involving most of Europe and their colonies, along with the Turkish Empire and eventually the United States. It left 15 million people dead and many millions wounded. Ireland, 200,000 Irishmen enlisted. The majority of them, of course, were Catholics. 35,000 of them died, many at the Somme and Gallipoli. Economics played a critical role in why the Irish joined up in such numbers. In other words, they accepted the King's shilling because they really had no choice, and unemployment drove them into the army, but they were there in very, very significant numbers indeed, as indeed were the Indians. 1.3 million Indian soldiers served in World War I, and 74,000 of them lost their lives. And it's interesting, in India today, people don't talk about that. It's still a very dark secret almost, although that is also changing. Of course, the outbreak of World War I created the opportunity for the 1916 Rising. England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. And so for the remainder of this lecture, I want to now shift to the consequences of the Rising, both the immediate ones and the longer term ones for Ireland and Empire. The immediate consequence of the Rising and the conscription crisis, which came very shortly after it, was the rise of the Sinn Féin party, which won a landslide victory in the 1918 elections and established the first Dáil Éireann, the Irish people's own national assembly. This man here, Eamon de Valera, who very much the founding father, if you want, of modern Ireland, was its first president. But de Valera spent most of the immediate years after the formation of the Dáil in the United States fundraising for the new Ireland, and it fell to this man here, Michael Collins, to lead the War of Independence against Britain, which dominated the years 1919 to 21. Really, Collins was the mastermind behind the war, and he's known today as the founder of modern urban guerrilla warfare, the first freedom fighter or urban terrorist. Now, at the height of the war, the Government of Ireland Act partitioned Ireland. This dealt a huge blow to the Dáil's bid for self-determination, and it arranged for two separate parliaments, one in the north for the 6 counties in Ulster, another, or 6 of the 9 counties in Ulster, and another for the remaining 26 counties. Then a peace treaty in December 1921 enshrined partition. Actually, it gave more concessions than would have been given under Home Rule. So the Irish Free State had the status equivalent to that of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. But of course the treaty divided Ireland dreadfully, and actually triggered then a very bitter, bloody 10-month long civil war, and included the destruction in 1922 of the Public Records Office, the Four Courts, which is of course where our archives were housed. So it's been one of those moments that we all look back at with very, very deep regret. And of course, the treaty, and who was in favour of the treaty and who was against the treaty, continues actually to dominate Irish politics. It has since 1922, with one party, the Fianna Fáil party, being, if you want, against the treaty, now led by Neil Martin, and here is Fine Gael, the leader is Enda Kenny, and as the ambassador mentioned, we are having our own political problems, and the question is, will Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil actually form a coalition? And it's the year to do it. It's not clear to us yet if that will happen. Ireland's in a bit of a political mess. However, it would be a very historic moment indeed should that happen. However, again going back to the 1930s, even though Ireland wasn't a republic, De Valera particularly took a whole series of steps to underline the separation with Britain. The 1937 Constitution was very significant. It effectively made Ireland independent, but it wasn't until 1948 that we officially became a republic, and then the following year withdrew from the Commonwealth. So there was some talk recently about whether Ireland would rejoin the Commonwealth. I don't see that happening, but anyway. The reverberations of the Rising were felt very widely indeed. There was a mutiny in the army in India, and this poor unfortunate was the scapegoat, Captain James Daly. He had to die, not for Ireland, but for India. It was all about then the control of India and the anxiety that we were going to see a domino-like impact. The other very, I think, significant link is the way that physical force republicanism found its mark, particularly in Bengal, and Bengali nationalists emulated Sinn Féin and Irish physical force tactics. So here we have the Chittagong Rising. It was actually Good Friday in 1930. It was a copycat rising. So Chittagong is actually today in modern day Bangladesh. But it drew direct inspiration from 1916, and its leader Sen was very much inspired by Pearse. They were in fact both school teachers. And if you look at the Chittagong Proclamation and the Irish Proclamation, obviously the Chittagong Proclamation would have been in Bengali originally, but some of the language is identical, and the sentiment is certainly identical. And Sen knew from the outset that Chittagong was doomed to fail, and he appreciated that what mattered was its significance as a blood sacrifice. The Bengali pantheon of heroes included Pearse, of course, but also Michael Collins, who was admired as the master of guerrilla warfare, Terence McSweeney, the hunger striker, whose example was copied by Das, who died on hunger strike in Lahore jail in 1929. But the great hero actually was a man called Dan Breen, and his book, My Fight for Irish Freedom, was translated into many languages. And what you have here is actually the Hindi translation of it, but it also appeared in Punjabi, Tamil, and was considered one of our Bibles. And I'm quoting here Chandra Bose, who is the Michael Collins, if you want, of Indian freedom fighters, where he says, in my part of India, Bengal, there is hardly an educated family where books about the Irish heroes are not only read, but devoured. Now, I don't want to suggest that other European revolutionaries didn't inspire the Bengali nationalists, because of course they did. But from the 1920s and 30s, the example of Ireland really takes precedence. And De Valera is a great hero for Indian nationalists. And De Valera was very keen to make, if you want, India's cause Ireland's cause, and he does so very publicly from the 1920s and swears, if you want, friendship, lasting friendship between the two nations. It's 1948, though, before De Valera actually manages to visit Delhi, and he does so as part of an anti-partition world tour. This photograph was taken on the 15th of June 1948 when the Mountbattens entertained both De Valera, who's on the right, and Nehru for lunch. It was one of Mountbatten's last official functions in his capacity as Governor General of India, and it's rather fitting that De Valera was his last guest, given the role that De Valera had played in the breakup of the British Empire. In addition to inspiring Indian nationalists, Ireland provided a model for the partition of India and Bangladesh, as it did for Israel and Pakistan, Israel and Palestine. And it was Jinnah, here, who's with Nehru, so there's Jinnah, who was the president of the Muslim League, who actually invoked the example of Ireland as he pushed for partition. And the division of Punjab and Bengal along communal lines and the creation of many Ulsters, and they actually use that phrase, many Ulsters, in the subcontinent, really concerned Gandhi, Nehru, and concerned De Valera as well. Because, of course, De Valera had never accepted the legitimacy of Irish partition, and Articles 2 and 3 of the 1937 Constitution claimed sovereignty over the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And interestingly, Pakistan followed the lead here when it became sovereign in 1947. It also maintained a claim to Kashmir, and of course we know major wars were fought over Kashmir. So I think the reverberations of the breakup of the British the reverberations of the breakup of the British Empire continued to be felt long after independence, particularly in India, where we see very intense communal violence. Over 500,000 people died. 6 million people were refugees pouring mostly into India from Pakistan, and then obviously there were 3 wars with Kashmir. We didn't see the same level of communal violence in the north, but there was some. But with the partition of Ireland in 1920, the British government created in Northern Ireland a Protestant state for a Protestant people, and by 1969 the Catholic population had basically got tired of living as second-class citizens, and so they called for an end to state-sponsored discrimination. And what began as a peaceful civil rights movement, of course, quickly degenerated into a very bitter and sectarian war that we call the Troubles, that lasted for 30 years. I moved to Belfast in 1969, and I remember sadly, vividly, scenes like this street violence. During these years, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, also targeted, if you want, servants of British imperialism, and probably the most prominent example was, of course, Mountbatten, who was blown up in 1979. He was in Sligo on holiday. Thank goodness now Ireland's at peace, and there's a speculation that the ballot box, rather than the bullet or bomb, might achieve a united Ireland. If we look at the census data for 2011, we can see that basically the Catholic population within a relatively short period of time will be the majority population in Northern Ireland. And then there could well be referenda on both sides of the border to decide whether Ireland might be reunited. At least that's a conversation that we're having in Ireland. It's conceivable in Ireland. It would be inconceivable to have that conversation in India and Pakistan. It's a very different outcome there. So I want to conclude with some brief reflections on how best to commemorate contentious events like 1916, which of course we are in the process now of celebrating. Next Sunday and Monday are very big days indeed in Dublin. And other events like the Battle of the Somme, and of course the commemoration of the Somme is coming up soon. It's the 1st of July 2016. I think the one thing we all know is that history and memory are very powerful political weapons, and in the wrong hands have done and can do very serious damage. I think in Ireland the memory of key events has often served to entrench sectarianism, and I see this very much in my own work on the 1641 depositions, but of course we also see it in some quarters with the 1916 Easter Rising, where it's remembered as the ultimate Republican blood sacrifice, or ultimate Catholic blood sacrifice. You have a mural here from Belfast. You can just see, here's Pearse and the men inside the General Post Office. Of course, you have to remember that amongst the most radical Republicans in Ireland, both in 1916 and in the past, were Protestants. Tone, Emmett, Davis, I've mentioned them, but they immediately spring to mind. Also, many Protestant loyalists have appropriated the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, as their moment of blood sacrifice for king and empire. And here we have a mural in Bangor, which would be a Protestant neighbourhood, 1st of July 1916. Yet, of course, Irish Catholics formed the majority of the 200,000 men who enlisted to fight in the Great War, and were certainly featured among the dead, and many of them lost their lives at the Somme. But because 1916 changed things utterly, those Irish Catholics who had survived the war were then excoriated as traitors when they came home. And it's really only very recently that families across Ireland have openly admitted, and more importantly, I think, come to terms with the fact a loved one had served in the British Army. Up until then, it was a very dark secret. It was sort of like an illegitimate pregnancy. Nobody wanted to admit it, to talk about it. I think this has been in large part thanks to some very, very public gestures by our presidents. And I say presidents because actually a lot of the bridge building began with this woman here, Mary Robinson, who was the first president to meet with her counterpart, obviously this woman, Queen Elizabeth II. That was continued by Mary McAleese and then Michael D. Higgins in a recent visit to London. But I think it was this moment that captured all of our hearts back in 2011, when Elizabeth II came to the graveyard in O'Connell Street, where we remember our war dead, and especially 1916, and she bowed. And it was a very, very, very profound moment, because she wasn't just physically bowing, she was bowing to the past, as Mary McAleese did. And by bowing to the past, they were acknowledging it, but they were also saying, let's not be bound by that. Very, very important moment. And the work of our poets, our playwrights, our creative writers, and our historians have really helped with this transformation that has occurred. And so today, people can remember without shame, without stigma, those who took the King's shilling alongside their fathers who fought against the British during the Wars of Independence. It also meant that those families were able to commemorate with great dignity 2014 and the outbreak of World War I, as indeed were we as a country. And I showed you a stamp earlier, but the Irish ambassador to Britain actually laid a wreath, and that was for the first time Ireland actively participated, and obviously the President did as well. Again, very public gestures, very important gestures. But commemorations always occur in very specific contexts. And the 50th anniversary of 1916, 1966, formed the backdrop to the rise of Republican nationalism in Northern Ireland and the outbreak of the Troubles there. Brexit and the upcoming UK referendum on whether or not the United Kingdom will leave the European Union will take place on the 23rd of June, and it will form the backdrop of both the 1916 Rising commemorations next week and of the Somme on the 1st of July. Those blood sacrifices so central to the identity of many. Now, I think the political consequences of Brexit for Ireland are very, very real. The re-securitization of the border with the North could well negate many of the gains achieved as a result of the peace process, because as the ambassador noted earlier, sharing a common European agenda has been extremely important for Ireland, North and South. It's given us great scope to work together. It's provided common cause. It's allowed us to play down our differences. However, the peace process is fragile. I never take it for granted. And as I say this as somebody who grew up in Ireland, and I don't know if it was reported in the Brazilian press, but very, very recently there was a bomb in Belfast, and the new IRA, and I put this again in inverted commas, the new IRA claimed responsibility for this. Of course, what they want to do is to destabilise Northern Ireland. And I think that if we're not very careful, anxieties around Brexit could well fire up the nationalism, the tribalism, the sectarianism, and the inhumanity that characterised the 1970s and 80s. And none of us wants to go back to those days. But I wonder if the gung-ho proponents of Brexit, particularly this man here, Boris Johnson, are really fully aware of the potential minefield that they're marching into. Because if we've learned one thing from the study of Irish nationalism, it's the way that one generation of Republican nationalists passes the torch to the next. In other words, there's nothing new about the new IRA. And I think it's very important that we do everything possible to support and create an environment in which peace and not physical force republicanism can flourish. And I want to simply end by quoting Edmund Burke: "Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it." Thank you very much.
Very much, Jane, for this wonderful contextualization of 1916 and even not only what happened before, but also the consequences of this till nowadays. I know that afterwards in the afternoon we will have the other lectures and we will be able to interact, but Jane is nearly leaving us. But if you have a very prominent question now, she is happy to answer. If not, we will leave for lunch, and then we'll come back at 2 o'clock here. Is there any question on the floor that you would like to ask?
Yeah,
yes.
So, an interesting side effect of what you're saying right now, that a lot of people in Britain have been with one grandparent, one Irish grandparent, have right to ask for Irish passport. And apparently in the last few weeks, there's been a huge rise in the number of people asking for Irish passports. I have a friend here in São Paulo. His mother's Irish. He's already got his Irish passport. Unfortunately, I only have, I think, one great-grandparent who's Irish, so I'm not eligible. Just an interesting consequence. If you have an Irish passport, you can go and live in Barcelona or Bratislava. Maybe in a few months' time, if you have a British passport, you'll be thrown out of Barcelona.
Thank you for that. You hate to end it on a sad note, but that could well be the outcome. Who knows? People are saying, is Brexit going to happen or not? And I'd love the ambassador's view on it, maybe, or I don't know if Sharon, or there's another comment here at the front. To begin with, we all thought, oh, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen, it'll be like the Scottish referendum, it'll be a lot of hype and a lot of talk, and then when it comes to it, people will retain the status quo. I've seen a big shift, and I think the whole migration crisis in Europe is not helping at all, and I think it's something that we should be genuinely concerned about. Where we are hearing comment and debate is around the economic consequences of Brexit, and I think obviously they're very real. I had a long conversation with the governor of the Irish, of our central bank, Philip Lane, and he says, Jane, financially it would be very good for Ireland, economically it would be disastrous. For me, though, the real disaster is the political, cultural consequence and impact of it. I'm not hearing or seeing any discussion of that in you see it in the Irish press, but you're not seeing it in the British press. So I think it's just a very, very difficult moment, and it's exacerbated by the fact that obviously the Irish government is in turmoil. I can use that language, I'm sure the ambassador, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but our eye is not on the ball. And I feel that it's a very delicate moment. I'm sure, hope it's all right. I'd hate it to be otherwise, because I actually think that aside from this not sinister, but this unsettling Brexit angle, the way that Ireland is commemorating 2016 has been genuinely reflective and using it as an opportunity to imagine a new Ireland. And I think it's been very exciting from that perspective. And you just hope that that doesn't get derailed. And I'm just, I'm concerned about it. Please.
So I want to thank you very much for this wonderful lecture, and apologize for not being a historian. I'm a chemist, so I just make a very superficial question, but I'm curious about the role that religion is playing in nowadays on the political Ireland. Is it still religion, like Catholicism, Protestant, playing a role on this political outcome of Ireland?
I was going to say that's some question to ask. The Catholic Church has collapsed and no longer would exercise the moral and social and religious authority of years gone by. So religion is a factor, maybe not in the Republic of Ireland, but where it remains a factor, to my mind anyway, is in Northern Ireland. So I grew up in Belfast, and it is tribal, it's sectarian. It's not about God though, it's about identity, and it's religion as a badge of identity. So again, I could go for a long time, and I'll spare you that. So I think it remains important, and particularly at moments of crisis, it does take on an importance that certainly I wouldn't feel comfortable with. And when I look at the 1937 Constitution and the way Ireland institutionalized the relationship between church and state, I think we should look back on that as a dark moment. When you compare it, say, with what went on in India, when Nehru oversaw the Indian Constitution, it was a profoundly secular state that he created. And I think, if Ireland had only done that at a certain moment, but that's looking back, that's a what if. So religion remains, I would take it very seriously, especially in Northern Ireland.
Thanks again, Jane, for a fascinating broad sweep of history, bringing us to events that haven't even happened yet. The referendum on Brexit. From our perspective, the decision that will be taken in Britain, which incidentally, 1 million Irish people living in Britain will have the right to vote in. And as our speaker above said, with so many people in Britain of Irish extraction, there is clearly a campaign going on to encourage people who have relatives in Ireland to vote in a particular way. The intervention so far of our government have been very clear in that it was recognised very early on that the country outside of the United Kingdom most affected by this decision would be Ireland, for all the reasons that you have outlined. And interestingly, within Northern Ireland, there has been a negative reaction on the part of one particular set of political leaders to the intervention of the Irish government in the debate. But in response to that, Bulgaria and Cyprus have as much of a right to speak on the issue of whether Britain stays in the European Union or not as the people of the United Kingdom, for the very simple reason that it is a club. And when you take Northern Ireland as a contested space, and the institutions, the very elaborate, intricate institutions that have been set up in Northern Ireland, to do something that it's not shared sovereignty, it's not sovereignty as we know it, and the power sharing arrangement that they have there is a completely innovative way of dealing with this conflicted space. The European Union itself has become a conflicted space. It's a postmodern experiment in sharing sovereignty. And when you share sovereignty, while many of the institutions, the national institutions you have, don't necessarily reflect how you share sovereignty, when it comes to a debate about whether or not you wish to stay in the club, the other members of the club are naturally going to speak on this. And it hasn't even been confined to the European Union. All of the partners of the United Kingdom in the world are making statements on this, and most particularly the United States. So it is a debate where we have to intervene. We have intervened in the way that we have, not telling the people of the United Kingdom what we think is best for them, but simply pointing out the context for us as the country that would be most affected by it. But it is interesting to begin a sweep that starts with the arrival of our neighbours in the 12th century, and an event that has not yet even happened in 2016, indicating that our destiny as the inhabitants of two wet islands off Europe remain intertwined.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Laura.